Is this thing on? Is this thing on? This thing seems to be on. All right. Well, it's funny talking about Urbit as a society, or the two. You see, I don't have slides. I do have a demo which will appear at some point, but you can gaze at this. But not yet, not yet, not yet, not yet, not yet. You can gaze at the beautiful mountain landscape, which is what this would look like here if it was raining. Uh, and So Urbit as a society, or Urbit as really a body politic or political body, is an interesting question, especially with some of the little bit of drama we've been having lately. And kind of what I want to do is I want to actually do an unusually short talk, and then kind of open it up to fun questions, because we're human beings and we find drama to be fun. But to start out, I was talking to someone who is not in the room actually, but that's all right. And he expressed a very simple definition of Urbit's success, or should I say Azimuth's success, because these two things are not entirely the same thing. And he was like, and this is perfectly true, that Urbit, or at least the Urbit namespace Azimuth, succeeds if it becomes, in as much as it becomes a standard form of identity. It's a very, very binary question. Either you're a standard identity or you're not. Either, this set of 4 billion weird names is worth something or it's not. And obviously, there's a lot of ways that could turn out. But one of the things that sort of brings, that question brings to the fore is that it's like, I went to a presentation from Worldcoin the other day. I don't know if you know Worldcoin. It's the Sam Altman thing with the orbs. They have orbs, and they place a very high premium on this idea that one of these identities is provably held by exactly one human, in as much as they're kind of like look at your retina with the orb, and then your retina is scanned, then you can authenticate with your phone, which is doing maybe a little bit of scanning, little weaker retina scanning itself, and it can really prove that you're this person. And then they do their level best, including some trusted computing magic, to actually verifiably delete your identity, so that all they know that is that this is one human, and it's matched this one identity. And but the sort of the interesting thing is kind of how this functions in a way as a business and as an economy, because basically the thesis of WorldCoin is that they really want to rack up the number of users in this system, and they currently have like 15 million or so. And they're looking specifically for very, very deep penetration in certain markets. Where they were, it wasn't depth, it was something like that. Um, but they boasted very proudly that they had something like 30% of people in Buenos Aires had installed this thing. They have like 15 million users, and when I say users, I mean paid installs. And so, because what they do is they have a business selling you this orb, and then you buy the orb for like $2,500, and then WorldCoin pays you for everyone you can go out and get scanned. So I don't know what you get paid to scan, an Argentine, but it's like, probably $1.49 or something. But if you're really assiduous with these orbs, you get all of these people scanned. My point about Urbit as a society is that I look at this and I'm like, okay, what is WorldCoin? I think they dropped the coin. Coins are becoming a little less hip, perhaps. It's a little worrying, and now it's just world, right? It's just world, and so, you know, I sort of, you ask yourself the question, what is world as a society? Like, is there a society of people in, say, Buenos Aires, where they've achieved this legendary deep penetration, right? Do worlders in Buenos Aires think of themselves as different from non-worlders? Do they have terms, maybe even terms of abuse,
that refer to people who aren't in world, like, do they, and the answer is no. Of course, it's not a society. It's just something you have installed on your phone. It's completely individualized. It's completely like disconnected. And I think what they're betting on is that they have enough paid installs that it becomes viable for other services to depend on the technology. And then you're just like, oh yeah, the strange app I installed on my phone, right? Oh yeah, that thing, right? But because the app, is still there. You still have a World ID, even if I have the World app on my phone. I am never going to think about it again after getting the demo, probably, unless it becomes a standard identity solution in the future. In which case, see Yarvin 4314 or something like that. And the like maybe that'll work. I don't know. I wouldn't want to bet against Sam Altman, but it's a very different phenomenon from what we're doing here or what we're trying to do here. And the interesting thing about Urbit is it sort of it like it sort of like crosses the boundary between this is a society and this is not a society because it's a completely decentralized space, and it's a completely decentralized space with plenty of room, realistically, for everyone. It's very easy to imagine, and in fact quite desirable to imagine an Urbit world that consists really of multiple completely non-intersecting societies. I mean, I'm a real believer in basically in I was about to say cults. Not cults, but in sort of closed parochial societies in general, like the Amish or the Mormons or whatever. And unlike most people with my cultural background, I really believe there should be a world where you grow up as a Mormon and you're on the Mormon internet, and everything on the Mormon internet is totally Mormon, and you get content warnings, bans for anti-Mormon content, things that are unacceptable. And it's just like your Mormon internet is going to work a lot like, the woke internet that we know and love, except it's going to be Mormon rather than woke. And you know what? That's all right. That has the right to exist in and of itself. I'm not a Mormon. I don't feel the need to be part of it. But that is one way to use a system like this, is to basically create, not, to sort of participate in the great internet dream of 1995, but actually to have a very different kind of dream there. However, that's not, of course, what Urbit is at present. That's something that would happen to Urbit once the Urbit community, of which there is only one, like actually was so successful and built out the tools so effectively that someone from a very different kind of insular, closed, parochial community, not George Soros's open society, was like, okay, let's build another society on Earth. Okay, but for now, really, there's only one Herbit. There's only one kind of social network of people involved in this thing, and so essentially, succeeding with this society means basically growing it in the right way, to include basically all 4 billion people in there. And there's something I believe in, you know, growing communities, growing user bases, growth in general is what Silicon Valley does. You do growth. We do curves that go like this. We're in the case of Urbit, curves that go like this, and Urbit has experienced, I think, several Gartner hype cycles. And we're currently, I would like to think, coming out of the trough of yet another one, but it's sort of one society and one community. And what really gives me, I think, there's a lot of things that give me a lot of hope for the future, but one of the main ones is simply the quality of the people in the room, because there's something that I always say, which is that the quality of a network can only decline. People want to join a club of people cooler than them, not a club of people less gorms. And so, this is why someone mentioned MySpace earlier. This is why Facebook is more valuable than MySpace.
when Facebook has 1,000 users and MySpace has 50 million or for 30 million or something like that. And that was because, very simply, elitism matters, and Facebook was at Harvard and MySpace was everyone. And so Facebook was like, okay, we've captured Harvard. Now we're going to go, what about Yale? Could Yale people, did they just deserve to be on the Facebook? All right, fine, yeah. And then they do Yale, and then they do the rest of the Ivy Leagues, and then they do Penn, and then they do all the other colleges. And then, everyone who is, sorry, obligatory Penn joke. And then there's this magic moment which all American millennials of a certain age remember, which was when they open it up to all high school students. And you're just like, wow, I can be on Facebook just like my big brother. And it's now that we sort of think of Facebook as a somewhat dated millennial network, um, that's it seems almost strange, but that's sort of the course of these networks. And basically, to think of Urbit, as entirely as a technology is really not entirely right. It is a society, and it has to be. I just used to say when I was building, this thing like 15 years ago, people would be like, "Well, what is it?" And I'd be like, "Well, on the bottom, it's kind of a kind of math, and on the top, it's like kind of social network." And they keep alluded that I was deranged, which was probably true. Um, and, so when we and most importantly also, or like relatively importantly, there's an economic structure to this society as well, which is absolutely mediated by the address space structure. Because kind of one of the original inspirations for Urbit that I had when I was, doing system software research, 20 years ago, I was like, how do you write a programming language or an operating system or any of these things? How do you write a programming language in Cell? And the conventional answer is very, very clear, which is that you don't. And that's a perfectly fine answer. Sometimes that's the way nature works. But then I was like, well, what if your language is attached to an operating system which is attached to a network, and basically then that if that network has a limited number of addresses, that those addresses will acquire value once the network basically built itself out, in the same way that land acquires value by being used. And so you can actually anticipate that and use that anticipation to fund the construction of the network. And that's sort of what we did, and why, despite many bumps, and there's this wonderful word that Ben Horowitz uses in his one of his Silicon Valley Airport books, which is WFIO moment. And WFIO stands for fucked it's over. um and so despite many of those moments, Urbit is still here. It's not completely fucked, and hasn't taken over the world either. And here it is. And so you have this thing that's sort of this, it's this economic entity, it's this technical entity in several different directions and dimensions, and of course it's this political entity. And in the sense of being a polity. And the interesting thing about being a polity is that actual political science, I'm not talking about the relationship of Urbit to, Trump versus Harris or anything dumb like that, but like political science starts to play a role. And so let me give like the sort of brief, if can you all hear me over the rain? Is this okay? This is great rain. It's not the only system, isn't. And I see why you did it here. And the it's like dramatic. Like the rain is always dramatic. You know. So what Aristotle teaches us about political science, basically we haven't really learned anything about political science since Aristotle. And one of the reasons Aristotle is so good, by the way, is that Aristotle, when he composed his politics, was relying on the independently written histories of literally hundreds
of independent Greek city states. So, today the world is like, is it one polity? Is it 4 to 5? It's certainly not 200. But literally, the amount of data that existed in a world of city states about how political science works was absolutely tremendous. And so you can see Urbit as kind of one of those city states. It's this sort of little place that wants to expand to include the whole world. We all can sort of see, we can imagine very easily a world in which everyone is running Urbit. And actually, in one of my more recent Twitter essays, I kind of go a little bit back to basics on the subject of basically digital land in a world where basically tokenomics is sort of increasingly focused on yield, which is a very um, I guess it was an issue that also concerned Mr. Charles Ponzi. I actually had to someone use the word Ponzonomics to me, literally and without any negative connotations whatsoever, and I was like, "Woo." I mean, at least the classic Ponzi or HYIP, pays its 60% interest in dollars rather than in shares in the Ponzi itself. Like we've clearly embedded something here, but I'm like, okay, kind of not wanting to play that game. What is the what is the equation for something that is a piece of like digital lands like this? What is the equation that determines the value of it? And I would say that to be considered a digital land, you've got to exist. We're not failing the Howey test here. Rather, we're not passing the Howey test here. You've got to already exist. You've got to be inherently a monopoly. So there has to be only one thing like this that can win. Let's say, for example, WorldCoin. It's a good example. So I don't know. It's an interesting question to speculate whether does the world need Urbit or does it need Azimuth? Does it need WorldCoin? Is there a way that it could be both Azimuth and WorldCoin? Not so sure about that. They're pretty overlapping in some ways. Uh, but when you when you look at the perspective value of a system like this, you're like, okay, what will one of these identities be worth? What will this whole system be worth in some abstract sense if it becomes a worldwide standard? What is the chance that the world needs a standard like this? And what is the chance that it's this one? So I would say for a generalized decentralized identity system of some kind, whether it's WorldCoin or Urbit or whatever, the chance that the world needs something like this is fairly high. The chance that it will be this goes up and down. But the value of a global decentralized identity system is definitely like a 4 comma kind of number. Like one of the ways I like to describe it is imagine what the suppose you had to own an IP address to use the internet or rent an IP address to use the internet, and your IP addresses were basically tokenized and NFTs essentially. What would an IP address cost you in that situation? And if it would cost you more than $250, that's a 4 comma network. That's $1 trillion, right? So whenever you're talking about basically you have this sort of small seed of something which really, really wants to expand to include the whole world. There are many other things that want to expand to include the world. There's a lot to win, there's a lot to lose. And when there's a lot to win and a lot to lose, you get this wonderful human phenomenon of politics. And going back to Aristotle, Aristotle describes basically 3 forms of government: monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. I would describe those as, not only forms of government, but forms of governance. They're basically forms of power. And each of those forms of power sort of exists or potentially exists in every government. So, for example, let's look at the government of North Korea. It's clearly an absolute hereditary monarchy.
And yet if you look at the name, the legal name of North Korea, the DPRK, that is one place name and three euphemisms for democracy. So clearly this word democracy is a powerful legitimating word. Basically, a democratic government means a legitimate government to us today. But when we look at, what democracy actually means in the sort of the literal sense of the word, it often seems very different from the word democracy that is used, in the, you know, New York Times or the Pyongyang Daily Worker, or other font such publications. So if we look at sort of within a system like Urbit, and this is where, I think it gets really interesting, because you see the, the pros and cons, or the power and the weakness of these forms. What do we see when we look at this? Well, first of all, we see several, depending on how you define an Urbit company, you see several things that look like Urbit companies. You see Tlon, which is a classic for-profit corporation. You see the Urbit Foundation, which is a foundation headquartered in the beautiful Cayman Islands. I keep thinking that we should do some kind of offsite in the Cayman Islands to like recognize our, like, our Caymanese had a heritage, like, and there are other companies like Zorp and Native Planet that are sort of going maybe slightly different directions, but a company is a monarchy. And that's what it means to be a company. It's impossible to imagine a company which is not led by a single person or co-founder group or sort of ruling whatever. And the way a company works is that it has one leader who says, we're going to do this. And everyone follows that leadership. And then the leader is accountable to something called a board, and the board is a set of people who are not involved in the day-to-day capacity in running the company, and who only get involved when it's imploding. And that's a very it's one of the things I've remarked on, and I have several blog posts about this. It's remarkable is that, you know, this way of running a large effective organization is clearly the most effective way of running an organization that exists. If there was another more effective way to run an organization, it would outcompete all of these companies in the market. What's really interesting, and I think really tells us a lot about, political science in a lot of ways, is that when people the corporate form is, of course, a classic, what Balaji Srinivasan calls paper belt legal form. And, when you look at basically legal contracts and legal, paper contracts, you can't help but sort of define them as kind of an antiquated version of the familiar technologies that we use today. So, like, you can't think of wax cylinders today, as anything but a very primitive version of screening. Right. And so when you look at the sort of this kind of paper technology that underpins these classic corporate structures, you're just like, well, this is kind of like a blockchain in a way. And, that leads me to one of my favorite anecdotes, which is absolutely true, which is that the American Revolution was largely, or at least in part, precipitated by high blockchain fees. Absolutely true, because if you remember your dimly remembered American history, you might remember something called the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was a blockchain fee. The idea was that every time, as an American, you filed a blockchain transaction, i.e., a contract or any kind of legal paper, you had to use this special stamped paper that was basically issued by, one block registrar in London. And it wasn't cheap. I think it actually wasn't really very high tax, but like the principle, they were very used to their zero fee blockchain, right? And so, like, there's kind of nothing new under the sun in that way, and that's why it's really super interesting that when people, realize that the powers of these new blockchain structures can be used
to create autonomous organizations that are not constituted by, as the great Canadian libertarian band Rush would say, any god or government. The sorry, I can't resist my Gen X Rush quote. I swear I'm not actually a Rush listener. Um, but when people get a chance to create their own version of this, they don't create something like the corporate. That is not the shape of basically the usual DAO. The usual DAO is basically a governance token where the people in the community vote on directly on governance, proposals. It's as if the shareholders of Chipotle were voting on the new burrito flavor, right? And you have this like, an eggplant party. This real Chipotle needs an eggplant burrito, man. And like it would be a travesty, and there's absolutely no way you could run a burrito company that way. Can you run an open source foundation with a nine-figure treasury that way? Yeah, as it turns out, you can, but I don't know that it works very well. If you look at basically, say, I don't know how much money. Does anyone, guess in dollars how much money the Ethereum Foundation has spent? Do you think it's in nine figures? I think it's in nine figures. I think it's definitely in nine figures. This is Jesus. And Jesus, Mary, Mother of God. And when you basically, probably to develop, say, Mac OS, Apple probably spends about $1 billion a year. And if you look at the difference between the effectiveness of a monarchical software construction, approach to software construction, to a sort of, DAO grant based decentralized kind of thing, you're just like, wow, obviously the monarchical structure is much, much more effective. The KPIs run on time, something, stuff like, right? and so there's a lot to be said for monarchy and as an organizational principle. And then you're just like, well, but if there's a lot to be said for it, why do people never choose it? Which is, I think, a very, it's an interesting and subtle question. And it basically leads me to the role of the next super important form of governance, which is aristocracy. Aristocracy or oligarchy, basically the rule of the few. And when you look at how like the classic open source project works, and especially the relationship of the classic open source project to corporate Silicon Valley, what you see is that the principle of oligarchy is absolutely at its strongest in the open source world, because everyone, the principle of oligarchy and aristocracy is personal success, personal excellence, as the German said, bildung, personal development, making yourself amazing. And when you go and you look at why people contribute to open source projects, including but not limited to Urbit, for free, you basically see that they're not doing something insane. They're doing something, they're testing their will against the elements, right? They're going out and slaying bugs and creating things. And in exchange for slaying bugs and creating things, what they receive is the esteem of their peers. And they basically form a kind of coalition of excellence, which is, I guess I hate the word meritocracy, but that's sort of what an aristocracy is supposed to be. And those people have a very interesting relationship with the kind of monarchical structure of like traditional software development. And you even see sort of different kinds of things where you sort of know that in one kind of project it's sort of doomed for like, you know, to sort of commercially compete with like Linux is kind of doomed, right? It's a doomed project. But also for an open source project to compete with Photoshop is also kind of doomed in a way. So you sort of see that maybe there's one kind of thing that's done better by one kind of organization and another that's done better by another. Moreover, actually, when we look at the most successful open source projects, they achieve, for Aristotle, the kind of key to good governance
was was a mixed government. I think a concept that's been somewhat abused in our idea of checks and balances. But what he meant is that it should basically kind of unite these forces in a harmonious way. And so, as an example of, say, disharmonious connection between aristocracy and monarchy, I think that one of the just for real world example, I think one of the countries with the most the worst disconnections between a monarchical regime and an aristocratic intelligentsia is definitely Russia, which has had this problem for the last 150 years, roughly, of the intelligentsia being sort of divorced from and antagonistic toward the regime. And and that clearly produces really bad results. The equivalent in basically the corporate world is like you'll have these people that are doing open source sort of purely for the love of the game, and then they're like employed by like a company, right? And maybe they're doing open source in their spare time, but maybe it's also part of the business of the company. And so you get in this weird situation where Linus Torvalds is like has like 17 bugs he has to fix in his like Jira tracking sheet, and it's like, no, that's not really the way you use Linus Torvalds. What you see it in these really mature open source ecosystems is that these people are in general employed by companies, but the companies don't really employ them. The companies sponsor them. And like you're not employing a developer of this caliber once this sense of aristocracy exists. You're sponsoring it, and that's all right. That makes sense. There's a certain amount of tension there between the the programmer's job of sort of seeking personal excellence and the company's job of seeking corporate excellence, right? And hopefully those things are kind of pulled to dovetail reasonably well into kind of a functional structure. But it's like the relationship between going back to medieval times, the relationship between the king and the nobility is really what produces kind of a successful state. If you look at the most successful regimes of the kind of classical era, you're looking at like Louis the XIV, Queen Elizabeth, people like that, um, and what you're seeing is that there's this kind of harmony between the monarchy and the nobles are not seeking excellence by destroying the monarchy. They're seeing excellence by being part of this court system, and that works really, really well. And so kind of preserving a kind of mixed system where you have both of these qualities, especially in a situation where, unlike classic open source, you actually have a working economic model where people can get paid and shit. And that of course causes a lot of complex. I mean, putting money into the open source equation does weird, weird things to it and makes it not quite itself and creates kind of strange incentives that are kind of counterproductive, but also, employs people in the right code, so there's kind of, pros and minuses there. The last force and, one of the most sort of is democracy. And I mean, democracy not in the abstract sense of like a democratic government is a legitimate government. I mean democracy in terms of the sort of the blind will of the people. And one of the things that happens when you basically, when you have all of these things working together, all these forces working together and creating great software, you have basically, this democracy, which is society as a whole. It's basically has certain things that it needs out of this technology, this tool base, this system, right? One way for them to get what they need is to know exactly what they need and have an election and vote for what they need. It's like the shareholders voting for the burrito flavor. There's a place for democratic voice in any kind of system. I'm not sure whether or not there's a place for Urbit, the place for a democratic voice is definitely, a place where you have very, very high quality people whose average, ideas are also very, very high quality. Certainly, Athens in 400 BC was a very, very high quality population, but they also executed Socrates. So, there's that um, by popular vote. Um, they had this wild system where the democracy serves as a jury. And so you basically, democracy is the ultimate force because it's the force that says, do we want this thing or not? And, overwhelmingly in a situation like this, the power of democracy is, you might have heard people talking about exit versus voice. Exit is like basically, I don't want to use this thing at all. Right. And most people, of course, by default, have exited Urbit in the sense that they were never in Urbit. Right. And so actually, the fundamental force of democracy is like, can you draw in users is essential. And I don't really think I think that Urbit as it is today is still an extended, sort of pure aristocracy in a way. And, everyone who's sort of a fan is sort of there not because they find this it's there because they sort of believe in the program. They're fans of what people come to Urbit because they're fans of what we're trying to do here. It's fanware in a sense. And that sense of being a relatively large, although not as big as say Burning Man, kind of intentional aristocracy is, I think, a really important point in defining what this group is today. Burning Man is certainly an intentional aristocracy. It's like, you go to Burning Man, and the reason people go to Burning Man, despite it being in some ways, but basically nothing else is. And all of that was lost basically through an excess of democracy, through the system expanding and becoming completely open. People use the term eternal September, which was when AOL was given access, to Usenet, which is, sort of like letting the, entire popular population of Bangladesh into Iceland or something. It just like it's a completely different vibe. And there's not that there's anything wrong with AOL is what AOL is, but like, it wasn't what people were expecting to see in Reykjavik, and the there are many useful lessons we can take from the early internet and from the things that were good on the early internet. Of course, the state of Urbit is in the internet in 1995. The state of Urbit is the internet in 1982. But the things that were going on in the internet in 1982 were still kind of extremely formative. I think in general, when you're talking about reaching that line between sort of the fans and kind of the first true users. There was someone who was up here who was talking about the superhuman and the superhuman idea of getting penetration. I think that basically the future belongs to what was the HXC high expectation customer. The future basically belongs to the power user. And the thing is, the first kinds of users that you're able to satisfy with a system like this are going to be power users who need something relatively deep. And so when you see basically a personal server like this, yes, Casey Rodimer can laugh at it, it's a toy, but then you're basically like, no, this can actually go not just deep enough to be, for example, in just one class of tools that are like one of the attractive kinds of early tools are actually things that are not networking tools that are basically single player mode, because single player mode is what you need to get the players in to have a multiplayer mode that works. And so two examples of kind of single player mode tools that are very, very suited to a personal server are number one, tools in the space of like sort of the personal creative archive, the personal notes archive. You're talking Notion, you're talking Rome. Victoria was showing us Federated Wiki earlier. That basically class of toolkit where you're basically people who are like very heavy creators who I do a lot of creating, and I like edit my essays in the Substack editor on Substack. It's ridiculous. It should be on my personal server, and I should just finish an essay and it should be automatically posted to Substack, and I should never have to deal with the Substack UI or the XUI or whatever. Right. And so there's a sense of like this could be an excellent tool for people with really deep personal data needs. Again, a high expectation consumer. There's another direction, which is a good example of going, which I've heard some people working on, where the phrase personal palantir came to mind. So you have all these data sets that include your personal data that are outside your control, and basically taking control of them, managing them, integrating them, et cetera, et cetera. This is what Palantir does for like government or corporate scale data, but doing it for your personal data with an active server that can go out and make requests on your behalf and basically go out and wrangle your data with a mix of documented and undocumented APIs. I was talking to someone earlier who hacked the Twitter web API, very, very laudable. Excuse me, X. And so it's those kinds of applications that will be the first things that really cross the chasm from the fanatical user to the true power user.
Um, I couldn't have asked for a better talk to go before my talk on Monarch, so that's awesome. Um, and my question is, I'm really curious about your general ontology. Like, what do you think reality is? And then what you said, you're talking about what you're trying to do. So then ultimately, what are you trying to do in the context of what you think reality is?
So I feel like we're basically on it sounds strange, but we're on this big rock that's kind of swinging around through space. It's swinging through the very rainy part of space at present. And the yes. Yeah, I'm an absolutely highly materialistic person, and but I think it's possible to sort of base you can take materialism and then you can say, wow, we live in a materialistic universe. So why is it that humans always invent religion and various other tangible things? There are various explanations of that. Mine is that that's sort of the way our brains are wired. But given the fact that it's the way our brains are wired, it would be a very poor use of materialism to disregard the fact that our brains are wired that way, because they are in fact wired that way. And so, even though we're material animals, we're also entirely spiritual animals. And so, one could really just as well say that, like, the purpose of writing, Urbit is to say, you know, what if if I hope you want to take this in a blasphemous sense, but if God were to design a computing environment, what would he design for us? Okay, he doesn't seem to be doing that, so we have to do it ourselves. And like, that's a standpoint which is not been restricted entirely to Terry Davis in his development of software. Larry Wall, for example, is inventor Perl is very much a Christian, and so you can develop software completely from that standpoint as well, and that may resonate a little better than like, how do I build the simplest thing to fuse light to go to?
So for this uploading that song, the looks into a chi. Did you align your Subban Kinkery to deadlift of like and either read it with the better agent of magnesia where he's trying to really get you
That's a no. It's a terrible idea. Like, we have to make material conditions worse, if anything. No, the point is to serve the will of God, right? But like, and in terms of the idea that optimizing, I mean, I forget whose talk it was earlier today, but they were clearly sensitive to the Wall-E question, if you remember that not very good Pixar movie. No, I think that actually, the mission of humanity is not to be comfortable. I think that actually you're happy and comfortable. I think that you could do that sort of reduces the entire economy to a fentanyl factory, really, and perhaps with some games and so forth, where you're
Presumably, you can't be high on fentanyl all the time, and or maybe you can. I don't know, But yeah, no, I don't believe that improving material, conditions is the aim of humanity. I believe that improving the fundamentally aristocratic vision of perfecting the human being itself is that. And when you see people who have sort of advanced far enough on Maslow's pyramid of needs that they basically get beyond kind of this sort of very animal sense of pleasure that Steven Pinker is into. I mean, he is an animal. We're all animals, but we're also people. And I think that one of the benefits of a personal server over the kind of consumer computing that we use now, which is very, very democratic, is that the personal server really allows you to step into your own aristocracy in a much deeper kind of way. And in other words, the personal server and like the power user really, really go together. And actually making a naive user into a power user, of course, as a boomer, have become less and less of a power user every year. But I used to use BI and now I use Apple Notes. But the but I BI is superior. It's actually most superior to Emacs in my head. Speaking of politics.